At approximately 1130 hours on the morning of February 27, 1942, 9 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers flying in a high-altitude formation at approximately 4,500 meters released their bomb loads over a slow-moving vessel in the waters south of Java. The target was not a warship in any combat sense that the term was still meant to convey. She was a converted collier, displacing 14,000 tons, capable of making barely 7 knots in her current condition, and armed with a handful of guns that could do nothing meaningful against aircraft at that altitude. She carried on her flight deck 32 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters, crated and unchocked and wholly unprepared for flight, along with 33 pilots who had come aboard at Fremantle with the singular hope of getting those aircraft to Java before the Japanese got there first. 5 bombs struck. The damage was catastrophic and immediately apparent. The vessel listed, slowed further, and began taking on water. The escorts attempted to correct the flooding. They could not. At 1345 hours after the crew had been taken off, and the decision made that she could not be saved, the destroyers USS Whipple and USS Edsall put 8 torpedoes into her and opened gunfire on her waterline. She sank in deep water south of Cilacap. She was the USS Langley. She had been, 20 years before, the first aircraft carrier the United States Navy had ever possessed. She had been the ship on which the doctrine, the technology, and the culture of American carrier aviation had been invented, tested, revised, and tested again. The men who had learned their trade on her deck had gone on to command the carriers that were now the most powerful warships in the Pacific. And she had died carrying crated fighters she never had the chance to fly, sunk by the successor generation of an idea she herself had made possible. To understand what was lost on February 27, 1942, it is necessary to understand what the Langley had been and what the Navy had made of her in the 20 years between her commissioning and her death. She had not been built as a carrier. She had been built as a collier, a coal delivery vessel, under the name Jupiter, laid down at the Mare Island Navy Yard in Vallejo, California, on October 18, 1910. The Jupiter was commissioned on April 7, 1913, and spent her first years doing exactly what colliers did, moving fuel around the fleet. She was not glamorous. She was not fast. She displaced 19,140 tons fully loaded, measured 165 meters in length, and made 11 knots. She was, in the vocabulary of naval architecture, a useful auxiliary. What transformed her into something of permanent historical significance was a decision made inside the Navy Department in the years immediately after the First World War. The war had produced the airplane, and the airplane had produced, in the minds of certain naval officers and theorists, a question that would not go away. What would happen when aircraft moved from the shore bases where they had operated during the war to the decks of ships, where they could go wherever the fleet went? The Royal Navy had answered that question with HMS Argus, commissioned in 1918 as the world's first true flush-deck aircraft carrier, capable of operating wheeled aircraft through a full cycle of launch and recovery. The United States Navy had no equivalent. The Navy's General Board identified the Jupiter as a suitable candidate for conversion in 1919. The logic was straightforward. She was large enough to provide meaningful deck space. She was already government property, and converting her would be cheaper and faster than building a purpose-designed carrier from the keel up. The conversion was authorized in 1920. She was decommissioned on March 24, 1920, renamed Langley in honor of Samuel Pierpont Langley, the astronomer and aviation pioneer, and taken to the Norfolk Navy Yard for conversion. The conversion required 3 years. The Jupiter's superstructure was removed above the main deck, and a wooden flight deck measuring 165 meters in length and 19 meters in beam was constructed above the hull. A small island structure was originally planned, but was eventually eliminated in favor of a flush deck arrangement, with a pair of small funnels that could be folded down to starboard when aircraft were operating. An arresting gear system, designed to catch hooks extended from landing aircraft and bring them to a stop in a controlled distance, was installed across the after portion of the flight deck. An elevator connected the flight deck to the hangar deck below, where aircraft could be stored, serviced, and prepared for flight operations. The conversion was not elegant. The result was a vessel that looked, to contemporary observers, something like a floating barge topped with a large wooden platform, which is essentially what she was. She was recommissioned on March 20th, 1922. Her first commanding officer was Commander Kenneth Whiting, one of the early advocates of carrier aviation within the Navy, a man who had spent considerable energy arguing in internal documents and board hearings that the carrier would prove to be the decisive naval weapon of the future. Whiting was aware that he was commanding an experiment, and that the success or failure of that experiment would determine whether his argument was vindicated. The first aircraft landing on the Langley's flight deck occurred on October 17, 1922. Lieutenant Virgil Chilton Griffin brought a Vought-Vi E-7S biplane down the approach, caught the arresting wire, and rolled to a stop on the wooden deck. The landing was recorded, photographed, and reported up the chain of command. It was not a particularly remarkable piece of flying in the technical sense. Carrier landings would become far more difficult and dangerous as aircraft speeds increased. But it was the first, and firsts in aviation carried a significance that the participants understood even in the moment. The Langley spent the following years doing the work that no one else could do because no one else had done it before. Every aspect of carrier aviation that would later seem obvious and well-established had first to be identified as a problem, studied, experimented with, argued about, and solved by the men who flew from and worked on the Langley's deck. The arresting gear system went through multiple iterations as the Navy learned what worked and what did not. The procedures for spotting aircraft on the flight deck, for moving them between the flight deck and the hangar, for fueling and arming them while other operations were underway. All of this was invented by trial and error, with the errors recorded in accident reports and the lessons incorporated into procedures that were then revised when further experience revealed their limitations. The aircraft complement the Langley could carry was modest by later standards. Her design allowed for approximately 33 aircraft, though operational loads varied depending on the types involved. The aircraft of the early 1920s were biplane designs of wood and fabric construction, far lighter and slower than the metal monoplanes that would populate carrier decks a decade later, and correspondingly more forgiving of the rough handling that an experimental program inevitably produced. The faster and heavier the aircraft became, the more precisely the entire system of launch, recovery, and deck handling had to function. The Langley's flight operations were studied by observers from every branch of the Navy and from foreign naval attachés who sought access to what the Americans were learning. The British, who had a head start through the Argus and her successors, watched with interest. The Japanese, who were developing their own carrier program with systematic thoroughness, collected every piece of public information available and supplemented it through their naval intelligence network. The Langley was not merely an American experiment. She was a demonstration, conducted in partial public view, of the proposition that carrier aviation was a viable component of fleet operations. The fleet exercises of the late 1920s and early 1930s provided the most direct tests of that proposition. The Langley participated in multiple fleet problems, the large-scale war games that the Navy used to test operational concepts against realistic opposition. Her performance in these exercises was a mixture of genuine operational success and profound limitation. She was slow. 11 knots meant that the fleet, which operated at considerably higher speeds, had difficulty incorporating her into formation maneuvering. She was small. 30 aircraft was not enough to conduct the kind of mass strike operations that theorists were already describing as the carrier's primary offensive capability. She was fragile, in the sense that her wooden flight deck and relatively thin hull offered no significant protection against the weapons she was liable to encounter in actual combat. By the time the larger and more capable Lexington and Saratoga joined the fleet in 1927, converted from battlecruiser hulls that had been authorized before the Washington Naval Treaty imposed its limitations, the Langley's role had already been partially superseded. The two new carriers displaced 36,000 tons each, carried up to 90 aircraft, and made 33 knots. They were fleet carriers in the full operational sense of the term. The Langley remained useful as a training and experimental platform, but she was no longer the Navy's primary carrier capability. The officers and enlisted men who had served on her through the 1920s had taken their accumulated knowledge with them when they transferred to other assignments. The pilots who had learned to land on her deck went on to fly from Lexington and Saratoga, and later from Yorktown and Enterprise. The engineers who had worked on her arresting gear and deck equipment took their practical experience to the design offices where the next generation of carriers was being planned. The Langley had been a school. She had taught an entire generation of the Navy how to operate aircraft from ships, and that generation was now spread throughout the fleet, carrying the lessons they had learned on her deck into positions where those lessons shaped every decision about how the Navy would fight its next war. In 1936, the conversion that officially ended the Langley's career as a carrier was authorized. Her forward flight deck was removed, reducing her length and her aviation capability to the seaplane operations that the Navy now decided she would support. She was redesignated AV-3, an aviation tender or seaplane tender, a vessel whose function was to service, fuel, and support the patrol flying boats that operated over the ocean from bases that lacked fixed facilities. The work was unglamorous but genuinely useful. Seaplane tenders served as mobile bases for the consolidated PBY Catalina patrol aircraft and their predecessors, extending the reach of maritime patrol aviation into waters where shore installations did not exist. The Langley, in her new role, was a capable and experienced ship. Her crew knew her thoroughly. Her machinery, which had always been reliable if not fast, continued to function with the dependability that had characterized her throughout her career. She was old, and she was slow, and she was no longer what she had once been. But she was still useful, and in the calculus of a peacetime Navy operating under severe budget constraints, useful was enough. She was at Cavite in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked on December 8, 1941, local time. She was withdrawn to the south as the situation in the Philippines deteriorated with the speed that would characterize the entire first phase of the Pacific War. She moved to the Netherlands East Indies, operating from various ports as the Japanese advanced through the archipelago, with a speed and violence that made each position untenable within days of its establishment. The Langley was a slow ship in a fast-moving disaster, and the combination made her vulnerable in ways that her crews and commanders understood clearly. The decision that sent the Langley to her death was made in the context of a situation that had no good options. Java was the last significant piece of Allied-held territory in the southwestern Pacific outside of Australia. The Dutch colonial government and its military forces, reinforced by American, British, and Australian units, were attempting to hold the island against a Japanese invasion that was clearly coming and clearly could not be stopped with the forces available. What the defense of Java required, above all else, was air power. The Allied air forces in the region had been devastated by weeks of fighting and by the cumulative losses of aircraft that could not be replaced faster than they were being destroyed. The solution identified by the Allied command was to ferry modern fighter aircraft to Java by ship, since the distances and the Japanese control of intermediate territories made any other delivery method impossible. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was the best American fighter available in quantity at that stage of the war. It was not competitive with the best Japanese fighters in a turning engagement, as had been painfully demonstrated in the Philippines and Malaya, but it was a capable aircraft against bombers, and its pilots had learned to use its advantages of speed in diving attacks that could make it effective against the more maneuverable Japanese designs. 32 P-40S on Java, in the hands of experienced pilots, would not have saved the island. They might have made the Japanese pay a higher price. The Langley was tasked with carrying the aircraft because she had the deck space and because she was available. She was not ideally suited for the mission. She was operating as a seaplane tender, not as an aircraft transport, and the adaptation required to carry crated and assembled fighters on her deck was improvised under time pressure. The aircraft were loaded at Fremantle, Australia, and the Langley sailed as part of a small convoy that also included the freighter SSC Witch, which carried an additional 27 P-40S in crates. The escort consisted of the destroyers USS Whipple and USS Edsall. The voyage north toward Java took the convoy through waters that were increasingly dominated by Japanese air and naval forces. The original plan had called for the Langley to be met by Allied fighter cover for the final approach to Cilacap on the southern coast of Java. The fighter cover did not materialize. The defending air forces on Java were too depleted and too pressed by immediate threats to spare aircraft for convoy escort over open ocean. The Langley and her escorts were on their own. At about 900 hours on February 27, 1942, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft found the convoy approximately 75 nautical miles south of Cilacap. The report was transmitted to the land-based bomber units of the 21st and 23rd Naval Air Flotillas, operating from airfields on Bali and in the Celebes. The bombers were launched. The Langley's captain, Commander Robert Paul McConnell, understood his situation with complete clarity. His ship could make approximately 7 knots. A standard fleet carrier at full power could exceed 30 knots, and even that was sometimes insufficient to evade air attack from determined high-altitude bombers. 7 knots offered no meaningful evasive capability. The Langley could not outrun anything. She could not maneuver sharply enough to complicate the bomber's aim significantly. Her anti-aircraft armament, 4 3-inch guns and a collection of smaller weapons, could put fragmentation into the air above her, but could not reliably destroy high-altitude bombers before they released their weapons. McConnell requested air cover through his radio circuits. None was available. He continued toward Cilacap, because turning back to Australia would have taken longer and would not have escaped the Japanese air umbrella. He was in a situation where every available course of action was worse than the one before it. The first bombing attack came at approximately 1130 hours. 9 bombers in formation, bombing from high altitude in the manner that had been proven effective against slow or stationary targets, released their weapons in a coordinated pattern designed to cover the maneuvering space available to the target. 5 bombs struck the Langley. The specific points of impact included the flight deck forward and amidships, and at least 1 bomb penetrated to the machinery spaces. The effect on a vessel of her age and construction was severe. The flight deck, never an armored surface, was wrecked. Fires started immediately. The list to port began developing within minutes. The P-40S on the flight deck, which had been the entire reason for the Langley's presence in those waters, were destroyed or damaged beyond any possibility of flight. The pilots who had come aboard to fly them had nowhere to go. The mission that had brought the Langley north from Fremantle was over before the bombs had stopped falling. The escorting destroyers came alongside to take off survivors and attempted to assess whether the Langley could be saved. The flooding was progressive and could not be controlled. The machinery damage was too extensive to restore power sufficient to maintain steerage. McConnell made the decision to abandon ship. The crew was transferred to the destroyers. The attempt to sink the Langley by torpedo and gunfire, necessary because a half-sunk ship drifting in those waters would have been a navigation hazard and a potential intelligence asset for the Japanese, consumed more ammunition than it should have. The Langley was old and her hull was worn, but she was also built solidly enough that the torpedoes fired by the Whipple and the Edsall did not produce the rapid sinking the destroyer's commanders intended. The gunfire was added to the torpedoes, and eventually the old ship went down. She sank in deep water. No wreck has been located. The fate of the men taken off the Langley adds a further dimension of tragedy to the day. The Edsall, carrying a portion of the Langley's survivors, was herself sunk later that same day by Japanese heavy surface forces. The circumstances of the Edsall's sinking were particularly brutal. She was intercepted by the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, along with accompanying cruisers, and subjected to a sustained surface action that she had no possibility of surviving. The Edsall fought, as American destroyers consistently did in those desperate weeks, with a ferocity that was entirely disproportionate to any realistic hope of outcome. She was sunk. Her survivors were taken prisoner. Most of them were subsequently executed by their captors. The Whipple reached Cilacap with her portion of the Langley's crew. Cilacap itself fell to Japanese forces within days. The campaign for Java ended on March 8, 1942, with the surrender of all Allied forces on the island. The P-40s that the Langley had been carrying, destroyed on her flight deck, never contributed to that defense. The Sea Witch, the freighter carrying the remaining crated fighters, reached Cilacap, but arrived after the port had become unusable for air operations. The aircraft were offloaded, but never assembled in time to fly. The entire operation had been an attempt to reinforce a position that was already beyond saving, and it had cost the Langley and a substantial portion of her crew. The 61 men lost with the Langley represented a small fraction of the casualties that the Southwest Pacific campaign would accumulate in the weeks following February 27th. The Battle of the Java Sea, fought on the same day the Langley was sunk, cost the Allied striking force 5 cruisers and several destroyers. The entire campaign for the Netherlands East Indies, from the Japanese landings in Borneo in December of 1941 to the surrender of Java in March of 1942, resulted in Allied naval losses of a severity that had no precedent in American naval history. Against the scale of that disaster, the Langley's loss might seem like a footnote. It was not, in the historical sense, because of what she had been before she became what she was when she died. She had been, for nearly 15 years, the institution through which the United States Navy had learned carrier aviation. The knowledge embedded in that institution had propagated through the fleet, and was at work, in February of 1942, aboard the carriers that had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga, and the Yorktown. The men commanding those ships, and the men flying from their decks, had in many cases begun their carrier careers on the Langley's wooden flight deck. The techniques they used, the procedures they followed, the tactical ideas they were beginning to test in combat, had been first worked out on the ship that was now sinking south of Java. The connection is not sentimental, it is institutional and technical. The arresting gear systems on the fleet carriers of 1942 were descended from the experimental systems tested on the Langley. The deck handling procedures, the flight operations schedules, the communication protocols between air, wing, and ship, all of it had been developed, in its earliest form, by the men who had served on the old converted collier that had barely been able to keep up with the fleet. The carrier doctrine that would prove decisive at Coral Sea in May, at Midway in June, and across the long campaign through the Central Pacific that followed, was built on a foundation of practical experience that the Langley had made possible. In that sense, her death marked the end of an era more precisely and more completely than most military historians have acknowledged. The pioneer age of American carrier aviation, the period during which the fundamental questions of how to operate aircraft from ships were being asked and answered for the first time, was defined by the Langley's operational life. It had begun on October 17, 1922, when Virgil Chilton Griffin's biplane caught an arresting wire on a wooden flight deck in the Chesapeake Bay. It ended on February 27, 1942, when the ship that had hosted that landing went to the bottom of the Java Sea. What came after was not the continuation of that era, but its product. The fleet carriers that fought the Pacific War were immeasurably more capable than the Langley had ever been. They were faster, larger, better armed, and designed from their keels up for the specific operational requirements that the Langley's years of experimentation had defined. The men who flew from them and fought from them operated with a confidence and a procedural fluency that came directly from the accumulated experience of the previous 2 decades. They were the heirs of the Langley, though many of them were too young to have served on her. The Navy did not name another ship Langley for decades. When the name was eventually revived, it was applied to vessels in a service that bore almost no resemblance to the converted collier that had carried the name first. The original Langley's career, from her commissioning in 1922 to her loss in 1942, spanned the entire arc of the transformation of naval aviation, from an experiment conducted on a barge with a wooden deck to the decisive strategic instrument of the Pacific War. She had been present at the beginning of that transformation, and she had not survived to see its full flowering. The men of her crew who survived the sinking and were not subsequently lost with the Edsall or in the Java campaign's later disasters carried their memories of the ship through long years. Some of them wrote about her. Some of them gave interviews to historians and journalists in the decades that followed. Their accounts have a quality that is difficult to describe precisely, a mixture of affection and rueful awareness that the ship they were remembering had been, for most of her existence, undervalued and underutilized in ways that her historical importance made poignant in retrospect. She had been called the covered wagon by the men who served on her, a nickname that captured both her ungainly appearance and her pioneering quality. The covered wagon was not a glamorous vehicle. It was a slow, utilitarian conveyance that carried people and essential goods across difficult territory, and it was made obsolete by the railroad even as the territories it had helped to open were being settled. The metaphor was more exact than the men who first applied it may have fully realized. The Langley had carried the Navy across the territory of early carrier aviation at a speed that was never fast enough and with a capacity that was never large enough, and she had been made obsolete before her work was truly finished. She rests somewhere in deep water south of Java, in a part of the ocean where the seabed lies several thousand meters below the surface. No dive has reached her. No memorial marks her position precisely. The Java Sea has remained geographically and politically complicated since the end of the war, and the wrecks of the many ships lost there in the terrible weeks of early 1942 have not received the systematic survey attention that the wrecks of better documented battles have attracted. She lies with the cruisers and destroyers that fell in the same campaign, in water too deep for conventional diving, and in a region where the historical attention of the post-war world was slower to arrive than it was for the battles of Midway or Guadalcanal. What the Langley left behind was not a wreck or a memorial. It was a method. The method of carrier aviation, the specific and hard-won knowledge of how to launch aircraft, recover them, maintain them, arm them, and coordinate their employment as a weapon of fleet warfare, had been developed on her decks and in her hangars and in the minds of the men who served in her during the 20 years between her commissioning and her loss. That method won the war in the Pacific. The Langley did not live to see it do so. She was the first. Everything that followed came from what she had taught.